Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final session of the conference, which is on COVID and the future of VCS funding. My name is Victor Momodu, for those who don't know me, and I work with Community Southwark. Before I introduce my panelists, I just wanted to quickly say that the first part of this session will involve our panelists actually talking about their response so far to the COVID-19 situation, and also we'll be looking at the future funding. So can I welcome our two panelists today? If I can welcome Sarah Tillman from United St. Saviour's Charity, and also Andrew Matheson from Southwark Council. So welcome. And so as I've just mentioned, the first part of the session today is actually you talking about your response so far to COVID-19 in terms of the programs you've delivered. So each of you will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll move to the second part, which will be looking at the future of funding. So can I ask Sarah to kick off, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. I think you've got a presentation somewhere.
Yes.
Great. So, hi everyone, I'm Sarah. It's really unnerving. I can see there's 73 people out there, but I've got no idea who you are, what you look like, or whether you're even listening. Thanks for joining. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm from United St. Saviour's Charity, so we're a long-standing sort of 500-year-old trust based in the north of the borough, but we've started more recently working across the borough with the Southwark Community Response Fund. So I'm going to spend 10 minutes just talking about the fund. I'm just wondering if I can take off that chat because it's blocking my screen. There you go. So the community, can you just go back up? Sorry. This is the purpose of the Community Response Fund that we set up in Southwark. So as you can see there, it was really set up to mitigate the impact of the lockdown on more vulnerable, socially and economically disadvantaged people in Southwark. Thanks. We pulled it together incredibly quickly. So it was part of the London Funders Community Response, which actually was launched 4 days after lockdown. And I just had a quick look, and we got our first grant out within about 9 days after lockdown. So it was all pulled together very, very quickly. It's a consortium of funders. So ourselves, United St. Saviour's, Guy's and St. Thomas's Charity, Southwark Charities, British Land, and St. George the Martyr and Peter Manette Trust. And there was some crowdfunding. So around £20,000 also came in from local people through Space Hive. Thanks. So in terms of just the headline figures, we've got at the moment £542,000 we've had in the total pot, and we've awarded £440,000 to date. That's including some that we approved this morning, and total grants awarded 45. And as I said, it was part of the London Funders Community Response, which I can talk about a little bit later, but it's basically a consortium of around 48 pan-London funders, and the total amount there is just over 18 million that was pulled together for COVID-related projects. And within this, so our local Southwark Response Fund is aligned to that. So we all go through the same portal, it's the same application form, and there have been so far two waves of this. So one is crisis, which is primarily around crisis food and essentials, and delivering differently. And the delivering differently grants were really for projects that were responding to the changes during the lockdown and had a cost implication. So if an organisation needed to deliver differently in order to reach its regular clients, there were cost implications towards that different kind of delivery. Thanks. Now, when we set it up, we weren't quite sure what was going to be coming through in terms of the applications. But we've ended up spending probably a larger percentage, possibly 2/3 of the total fund, I think, once all tallied up, was for food and essentials. We thought at this point in time we wouldn't be needing to do that. We thought we would move on to much more delivering differently applications, but the demand for food and essentials across Southwark has been so high, we've had to keep looking at those different applications and getting funding out there so people can basically eat. So far, 12,400 cooked meals we funded. Now around 100,000 out of the 440,000 has gone to BAME-led groups, which is pleasing, and we've tried really hard to make sure that that happened. And particularly to many local and faith-based groups across Southwark. There have been a real surgence of these groups that have been responding very, very quickly to the crisis. And we've also provided infrastructure support, so staffing and other costs, to 5 of the 8 food distribution hubs that are now operating across the borough. And in terms of the total distribution of the fund, around 32% of it has gone to initiatives that are across the borough, 34% in the north and 34% in the south. So roughly even. And for United St Saviour's, because we have not actually worked in the south of the borough, that was really a useful foray for us into the south and to see the differences between organisations in the north and the south. And I think we found in the south probably a lot more faith-based groups that were responding to this challenge than possibly there were in the north. But we've yet to do some really solid analysis of the data. Thanks. So the kind of things that we've been funding up until now is food and essentials vouchers and food and essentials, particularly to vulnerable families, so single parents, people who are getting social workers, who are vulnerable in many ways. I think I'll come on to this later. Food supplies and essentials to refugees and asylum seekers, so a large amount has gone out for that. Lots of cooked meals. And this has not been explicit, but I think a lot of those meals have gone to older people who would probably have been going into community centres and getting various kinds of support from charities generally, but of course can't do that anymore and are in need of cooked meals. There have been a lot of businesses that have started getting involved, as you've probably all seen, in terms of providing cooked meals and getting them out to people. And some of our funding has gone to that as well. We provided an online choir, funded an online choir for people with mental health issues, laptops and Wi-Fi connections, so dongles for young people who have obviously not been going to school and are in need of this at home and don't have Wi-Fi and don't have laptops. Supplies and support for particularly high risk and vulnerable groups, so homeless people and care leavers, and that included mental health support, because as we know, there's been a real impact in terms of mental health and anxiety across the board, with particularly population groups more affected. And we've funded advice and mental health services, some specifically for particular BAME groups or to the Latin American community. We know there's a large Latin American community in Southwark, and generic advice services too. Thanks. And I just thought it'd be quite useful. It's been a really, really interesting and quite distressing, but exciting project to get involved with, and partly because of the collaboration between the funders, which has been really excellent, and we hope this will carry on. But it's been interesting to get involved with the council as well, because I've been sitting on their COVID hub, because we have been exchanging information on an ongoing basis with the council around needs, and to help make sure that there was proper coordination and not duplication. And I think some of the things that have really hit everybody quite hard, and I know some of these things came up in a meeting that was just, or the session that was just before lunch, which I came to the end of, is the huge number of people in Southwark who are financially and socially vulnerable. I think we probably knew they were there before, but I think this has really highlighted the fact that there are so many population groups in Southwark that were simply not able to feed themselves after the lockdown and lost their jobs immediately and were just not resilient. The critical and nimble role played by the community and voluntary sector, I mean, it really was unbelievably impressive how quickly many organisations responded to the lockdown, really quickly just changed their service model, their delivery, what they did. They started getting food out the door, I mean, really within days. So impressive. And I know that it's probably easier for the voluntary and community sector to move quickly rather than the council or public institutions, but we were all incredibly impressed and pleased, because I think without the voluntary sector, we would be in a very different position to where we are now. And the importance of those little kind of niche community or faith groups that reached out to those in need. Frequently it was the people that they were working with anyway, but sometimes extending beyond that. And often those little local groups teaming up with the mutual aid groups that emerged as a result of the lockdown, which were also talked about earlier. And sometimes those collaborations working really well. Obviously, the huge surge in local giving and volunteering, which I know has been touched on today, absolutely. When we did the crowdfunding through Space Hive with the support of the council, and literally as soon as the council's newsletter went out, money was just flying through the door, and I think we raised around £20,000. People wanted to give. They wanted to give in money, and they wanted to give in terms of volunteering, and they wanted to give back to their community. And I know that's a challenge for all of us, is how we harness that moving forward. And then a surge in collaboration. And I think that surge in collaboration was not only between funders, but it was between voluntary sector groups, between businesses and voluntary sector groups, and of course with the council, and data sharing as well, which is now starting to happen. And it's almost a lot of these things that we've talked about wanting to do for so long suddenly happened as a result of the lockdown, as a result of COVID. And again, we've got to keep that collaboration going moving forward. I think one of the big things that came up very quickly, that a lot of the charities that were responding to the lockdown had IT challenges. And that's probably because of not sufficient funding going into core over the last few years, and I'll probably blame the funders for that. But a lot really struggled in terms of their servers, having the right kind of laptops. And I think several organisations, we actually put some funding into that as well, so that they could reach out to their clients. Thanks.
Sarah, sorry, just to make you aware of the times as well, so apologies.
Yep, sorry, yep. So life after lockdown, spike in need and demand, I think will be huge. Holes in charity finances, charity staff burnout. I think a lot of people have been working incredibly hard. Data, how we continue data sharing, and again, how we maintain the community and volunteering and the partnerships and collaboration. And I think my last slide was actually about the future of funding, but did you want to talk about that separately? And I don't need to use a slide, I can just talk.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sorry, Sarah, we'll come into that after Andy's presentation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Sarah. Can we bring in Andrew, please?
I'm Andy Matheson in the Council's Community and Voluntary Sector Engagement Division. Victor, there is a presentation as well if you want to pull that up.
Yeah, okay, coming up.
So I've been working closely with Sarah during this period at United St Saviour and Southwark funders. I sat in on some of the sessions earlier today, the bounce back session and the community hub session. And again, it was sort of really interesting to hear how the conversations kind of mirror the conversations that we've been having as funders, whether it's with other local authorities or through London funders networks or at a local level. So lots of the theme but certainly what we've seen with the voluntary community sector is just an incredibly quick response to some of the challenges. But I'll just start with one of the things that there was some really good leadership here from London Funders, which is a network organisation, and they they realised that there were going to be issues very quickly around grant funding and flexibility of grant funding. And so the council signed up to a statement which aims to provide reassurance to the voluntary and community sector that we would be flexible around how grant funding would be monitored and what activities would be delivered, how they might be delivered, financial flexibility, and as much as anything else, maintaining dialogue. So we were glad to sign up to that at a very early stage. There was total support from that within the council. And it's just, if you like, it's provided breathing space for us and for the sector to be able to think about and take in all the changes that have happened so quickly, and that both at an individual level and sometimes at an organisational level could have been overwhelming in various ways. So just if we go on to the next slide. So one of the things that we don't know at the moment is how much of the VCS in Southwark is mothballed or how many staff are furloughed. We don't have that information. What we do know is that lots of organisations have been super actively involved in the community hub, have been working at a local level with local communities, but also have adapted their services. So we've selected some of the information about community groups, voluntary sector organisations that are funded through the council's Common Purpose Grants programme, where we do provide core funding and where we do provide longer term funding. So the bike project is, to give an example, is still providing free bikes to refugees with social distancing in place, an online cybercyclist programme. Latin American Disabled Peoples Project, so again, moving to a more online telephone advice service. Some of you will know of Mental Fight Club, who deliver a weekly cafe in the basement of St George. I think it's St George the Martyr, actually, on Borough High Street. Very well used Dragon Cafe, a very well thought of and really interesting model. So they've gone online and tried to offer that service, the way that everybody else has been trying to adapt. And then also Surrey Docks Farm. So we know that groups are trying to keep in contact with their most vulnerable clients. So we've got, I think one of the things that is really important is that we do have evidence of the strength of the voluntary sector in Southwark. And I say that in terms of the funding response. So we've had an enormous response to council COVID funding. So within the council, £380,000 was identified in April to provide a specific response to the community sector, or for the community sector, to respond to the pressing needs. So wave one council recommendations, funding recommendations, were agreed, I think it was April or the beginning of May. 93 organisations were funded. That fund, the whole design of that fund, was to make it as flexible as possible, so that not just the community sector, could apply, but also businesses that had suddenly started to engage with the community, provide services to the community. So in terms of the applications that were received for round one, 8% were from businesses, 16% were from constituted voluntary or community groups, 8% were from grassroots groups of local volunteers. So typically some of the mutual aid type groups, some of the groups that had sprung up to respond to COVID. 56% were from registered charities and 12% from TNRAs and tenant management organizations. So I think what we can say about that is that the reach in terms of the different types of organizations that could apply and did apply is good. Having said that, the demand has way exceeded the available funding. So the Wave 2 recommendations are currently pending. And what we've been doing within the council is liaising with Southwark funders, looking at what's being funded through the London Community Response Fund, and try to maintain an open dialogue to make sure that we're able to support applications that reinforce each other and at the same time not duplicate funding. And so that kind of dialogue is ongoing. And it's a dialogue that happens with different council departments as well, who are involved in food funding or community hub or digital inclusion type of initiatives. And so it just takes a lot of conversations, a lot of sharing of information, and a lot of collaboration. Sarah, I think, has already talked about the London Community Response Fund, so I won't go into that in more detail. Right, so if we go on to the next slide. So London funders and the London Community Response Fund, they've done some equalities analysis of certainly their Wave 1 funding. We've also done some equality analysis linked to identifying which protected characteristics are met by by the groups that are applying for funding. This isn't an exact science. If you look at those figures, you can see that there's 25% that seem to be going to groups that are user-led in terms of race. Now, how would we say whether that is a success or not a success in terms of the needs of Southwark and who some of the most vulnerable communities are? But it's a piece of work that helps to, if you like, establish some of the parameters around the groups that are applying and the groups that are being funded. We did some work with other funders and with Community Southwark and with the GLA last year, which was looking at developing indicators for what a healthy civil society might look like in Southwark. And we could compare some of this data at some point with the recommendations that came out of that piece of work. We know that equalities infrastructure in the main is not funded at a local authority level. It is funded at a London regional level to some degree, but again, there's less funding that's gone into those kind of organisations in recent years, which means that maybe there are gaps in our knowledge. And we know that there's been, in terms of COVID, there's so much more evidence now that there's been disproportionate impact on certain types of communities. Whether that translates into some of the social and economic needs that are emerging as time goes on, it's part of that thinking about that. If we just go on to the next slide, please. So council funding programs. So at the moment, we've got our existing council funding. We publish these council funding programs through a council forward plan, which Catherine Pitt in our team pulls together. So it's really gathering the information from the departments and then providing as much notice as possible to the voluntary community sector about commissioning programs. So for this year, our core common purpose grants will be continuing as usual. And those groups that are in 2-year grants, there'll be funding advertised later this year in the autumn, where those groups that are currently funded will be able to apply again, as well as other groups. So Black History Month would normally have taken place in October. At the moment, we're in discussion about whether that could happen or whether it needs to, a different approach needs to be taken because of social distancing and so on. We've recently let two new 5-year contracts with Citizens Advice Southwark and Southwark Law Centre. And we know that the demand for advice arising from financial exclusion, people losing jobs, the furlough schemes as they all evolve, the economic impact of COVID and claiming universal credit is going to put a lot of strain on those services potentially. Neighbourhood fund grants have been awarded for 2020-21, and officers who manage those have let recipients know that they can change or postpone activities to take into account social distancing, lockdown, and so on and so forth. Culture grants have been rolled over to 2020-21. What we hear from our arts organisations is the ones that are funded by the council have been moving to more of an online presence and maintaining engagement. And so if we just move on to the next slide.
Sorry,
Am I okay for time?
Yes, you have come up to the 10 minutes, so maybe 1 minute to wrap up.
Okay. So thinking through the next stage. So the question is, what in terms of COVID and future funding, and what do we do next in terms of identifying funds as a council and with other funders? How do we think strategically about what we need to do? So I think the questions that are being framed at the moment are in this way. So what are the emerging community needs we should support? What are the challenges that VCS organisations are facing? What do we do to make sure we have a sector in 12 months' time? What strategic interventions are needed? How does developing and sustaining local community resilience fit into our wider response? So we know that some of the key issues that are around mental health. So how do we do funding in a way that flexes services or enables services and the VCS to meet the needs of the economically impacted and also those who are already vulnerable due to health and will continue to be so? And I think that we just have to we need to continue the conversations that have been going on, and think about a medium-term and potentially long-term response. But at the same time, as things are evolving, have been evolving very quickly, and maybe now may slow down a little bit, but we don't know. So thank you for listening, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Sarah and Andy. So I did mention that we had a slot for the future funding, and obviously based on what you've learned so far, and in terms of the current easing of lockdown, I'm just wondering what are your thinking, both of you, in terms of what the short, medium term funding will look like, and in terms of joint working, is this something you see actually carrying forward more in terms of the way the funders have actually come together and collaborated? How do you see this shaping up? So this is to both of you, really.
Shall I, George? So, I mean, conversations are going on at the moment with other funders. There's a sort of view from one of the, particularly around financial inclusion. So we're talking to one of the main local funders at the moment around developing a kind of financial inclusion shield project. And so that involves really looking at what the kind of impacts and needs are going to be arising from the economic situation, the need for advice, for instance, access to advice, and just understanding the impacts on people, on particular communities. We know there's been a particular impact on the Latin American community in Southwark in terms of work, because of the type of work that many of the people in the Latin American community have been doing, which are in sectors that have been particularly badly affected by lockdown. I think it's really, for me, it feels like it would be useful to have a little bit of a pause and just try and think strategically about the medium term and long term, because everything has been done so quickly, and quite rightly so. Sarah, do you?
Yeah, just add a few things. I'll just add a few things in the context. I just got off a Zoom, another Zoom just before this, with the London Funders Group, which is the 50 pan-London funders. And there's a bit of analysis going on there in terms of what has been funded and what kind of groups and where. And it's quite interesting. Of that 18 million, 14 million's been awarded, but Southwark has been awarded the greatest amount in terms of the whole of London, followed rapidly by Lambeth. Now, whether that's to do with need, and I'm sure we have a very high need here, particularly in terms of NRPF, no recourse to public funds, and refugees and migrant groups, and high levels of poverty. But it could also be because we've got a very dynamic, busy voluntary sector, and that we've had specific funding focused on Southwark, which has probably contributed. But I think it's just worth being aware of that a lot of funding has gone to Southwark over the last 2.5 months. I think collaboration between funders will continue. I think it's like many things in COVID, it's catalyzed things that we wanted to do for some time. I think this will continue. Collaboration between funders, whether it's a shared application form and a shared process like the one we've just gone through is another matter. But I think certainly there will be continued sharing of data and sharing of strategy. And I think at the moment there is, as Andy said, a stepping back and thinking, what are the implications of this as we come out of lockdown? What are the gaps? What are the challenges? Where, as a group of 50 funders, do we need to start thinking about putting our resources? One of the things, a few other lessons that's worth reflecting on, because it will have implications for Southwark, not necessarily for Andy's funding in the council, but in terms of funding into Southwark. There is a recognition of the importance of very small local community groups in responding to COVID. There's a recognition of the importance of core and flexible funding. A lot of funders are talking about the importance of that, which they haven't done sufficiently in the past. I think there's a big focus on, there's an acknowledgement that there is going to be big holes in the budgets of voluntary sector groups going forward, and that a lot of funding has been thrown at the crisis necessarily, but there's a recognition that actually coming out of COVID, what do you do to maintain those really important voluntary and community sector groups across London? And where is that funding going to come from? Because actually a lot of the funders have been massively hit. We've been massively hit at United St Saviour's because a lot of our income streams are based on property. And so we're not going to be getting income in all likelihood for several months from our properties. And I think a lot of other funders are in the same boat, and our investments in the money market have obviously taken a hit. But a lot of the bigger funders have great big reserves, and their great big reserves need to be tapped into at times like this, rainy days like the one we're in now. So I think you'll see a lot of the big funders continuing to be putting resources into organisations. In Southwark, I think there's a recognition there's going to be a big spike in need coming out of COVID. And I just in terms of the specifics of the London Funders Response Fund, we've got at Southwark, there is going to be a wave 3. We may not participate as the Southwark group of funders in the wave 3 because we're nearly through our funding. But at London wide, there will be a wave 3 to which all local organisations will be entitled to make applications, and that will launch in early June.
Okay.
So that I'll probably leave it there, but obviously I can take questions. But
Of course, yes, we'll have a Q&A section, but before that, I'll just hand over to Chris, who's going to run the poll.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thank you both, Andy, Sarah, and also thank you, Victor. So again, for those of you who've been to earlier sessions, you will be familiar with this. But if you are able to go on your phones, ideally to vvox.app. For those of you who are not familiar, just to let you know, if you just in your browser put vvox.app, it will ask you for a code. and then if you enter the number below, that allows us to run a very quick poll. So we're aiming to have 3 very quick questions on that poll, see how that goes. And then we're going to move on to the question and answer session. So if people want to start asking questions now, you're very, very welcome. Please do it via the Q&A feature. We will be collating them and we will be passing them on to the panelists. If you think there is a particular question that you want to upvote, then please do so by clicking the like link, and that will mean that question will move towards the top. So I'm going to close this screen share now. Hopefully people had a chance to log in. And we're going to have our first question. So let me just allow to share the screen on that as well. There we are. So these are the answers as they're coming through. Obviously, you know, those are questions specific to charities. So some of those attending might not, might not find them relevant, but we were keen to use this opportunity and just run those questions during the session here. We've had 24 answers so far, I think. So if I leave it for another second or two, if anyone else who hasn't responded yet, it will do it now. If not, I'm going to move now to the next question. So yeah, that closed the poll for us at 56% of those worried about the survival of their charities. So we have our next question. And again, if I could ask people to take some time to answer those. I think this question might potentially apply also to those who run other services or are involved in other services, not just charities, who are on the session and on the call this afternoon. So please take some time and select one of the 3 options available. Yeah, and I'm just about to close that poll. So any final calls there? Thank you. And here we've got the answer at 76% in regards to those worried about not being able to meet the needs of their beneficiaries. And our final question, final quick poll question now. Very relevant for this section of the conference and probably for the funders taking part as panelists this afternoon as well. So again, if people want to take a moment to answer this, if someone hasn't had a chance yet, and I will be looking at closing this poll now. And we basically have the highest response so far. So 83% of participants worried about increased competition for funding. So that closes the poll section and it's back over to Victor. Thanks very much. And the panelists and your...
Thank you. Thanks for that, Chris. I'm trying to pick up the questions. I think one of the questions I actually managed to pick up was a question about how the Latin American community can be involved in developing the next stage of the funding programs. Not quite sure exactly, because I'm sure you developed the funding programs based on the intelligence you've actually put together. So they wanted to know how they could be involved in this. Is this a question of them just sending their views to you, or how do you want to respond to that?
Well, just I think that maybe as we develop the kind of medium-term, longer-term strategic response, there will be more of an opportunity to do some engagement around priority needs. I think it wasn't really possible to do that in the first stages of the emergency. It was all about meeting those very, very pressing needs. Certainly in the council, we have various structures that enable that kind of dialogue to happen, as well as people just contacting us and telling us what they think is needed through our contact. There's been a Latin American network that the council has been involved in through our division, and they've been supporting that. I think, yeah, just that really for now. I mean, we are monitoring which communities are responding to the funding application opportunities, and we do also fund a couple of Latin American organizations through our core programs. So the opportunities for having dialogue about what the needs are there in place through those relationships.
Thank you.
Shall I just add to that? I mean, I think coming out of this, there needs to be a lot more analysis of the impact on different population groups and a lot more discussion with those particular population groups to understand what intervention are needed and where resources need to go. We're not in a position to be able to say we've got a big chunk of funding to go to be informed going forward, but I think across Southwark, and I think this came up this morning, is there needs to be a strategic view informed by intelligence and informed by the voices of all the population groups in Southwark, not just the Latin American population group, but all the voices in Southwark that inform as a borough how we go forward, as a borough in terms of the council, as funders, as the voluntary sector. This is the time to actually be pulling together and talking and analysing and understanding a lot more around what disadvantage looks like in the borough and where we need to focus together moving forward.
Well, thanks for that. There's another question which says that they're worried about the education needs of children from vulnerable families because many of these parents are unable to support those children. So they've not been able to catch up even with the homework that they should be doing during this isolation period. And they just wondered if you actually target or support organizations or networks that actually support those children during this lockdown.
Shall I go?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't at the moment funded that much focused on young people. We thought there would be more applications coming through, and there haven't been that many. Partly, I think, because the demand up till now has been for food and emergency. But also, I think partly because people haven't known how to work with young people during the lockdown. So we all know that this is a desperate need. We know that young people will be particularly disadvantaged, those from disadvantaged backgrounds anyway, when they go back to school. So we know it's a need.
There's at the level of meeting individual needs of young people and children who are in school, there is one of the Southwark funders, which is, I think, is Newcomb and Collett, who are able to respond to some of those needs on an individual basis. For instance, if children who are at home don't have laptops, so that information we can share that information. I know colleagues in children's and adults services, they're working very, very closely with the schools network to try and build stronger links with the voluntary and community sector to enable these kind of opportunities, or at least to plug some of these gaps. But I mean, certainly it's a big issue that we won't be able to quantify until a bit more time has gone on.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. I know both of you shared some statistics from the current funding you've actually given to the sector. There's a question here about whether you agree that there's a need to actually shift away from funding few larger organizations to actually funding more smaller organizations who obviously have a reach in terms of local activities. I'm not sure if you actually give any stats about the size of organizations that you've actually funded during your programs.
I haven't got stats about that yet. What I would say is the London funders, this consortium across London, I don't think that was set up necessarily to support very, very local groups, informal groups. I think it had its advantages in many ways, but I think the best way to get to those really, really local community groups reaching particular communities is locally. We have to do that in Southwark with funding that is much more nuanced and much more responsive to the needs of those groups, and it means reaching out to them as well. And I think, as I said earlier, there is a recognition that these groups are really, really important and have proved their worth and their value through the COVID lockdown. I can't remember what the question was.
Well, the question was shifting from funding small, large organizations, to focusing more on small organizations. Yeah.
I think it's both, if I'm completely honest. I think we need to find ways of reaching those little small local groups, but recognize the value of the larger ones as well, actually, in reaching more people and in terms of systems and processes. I think it's not mutually exclusive, but I think it's both.
I mean, I probably would want to just mention again the council's Neighbourhoods Fund, which is an annual grants programme, which is there specifically for those smaller groups who are delivering activities at a local level, at a ward level. And that is a significant amount of investment on an annual basis. As I mentioned earlier on, awards have been made for the current year, and those groups will be able to either deliver the activities or to postpone them based on what the nature of the application was. And we also have the Cleaner, Greener, Safer annual fund. So there are funds that exist within the council's portfolio of different funding opportunities, which are there to meet a whole range of different needs. The question will be what the impact of COVID is on that mix of different funds going forward as we think about how to meet the needs and what happens with our budgets, because there may be significant impacts on our budgets as well. So I mean, yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it's a question that we always try to bear in mind when we're thinking about the funding mix. People earlier on in the day, in one of the earlier sessions, were talking very much about the role of individuals who aren't even involved in organisations in delivering vital community support and meeting community needs and building networks and being good neighbours. So those smaller funding streams are all really important in making that happen.
Thank you. So there's another question here talking about BEMA groups and wondering if there will be support available to co-funding available to develop business development plans, in terms of helping them to actually grow the organizations. And I think I'll just link that to another question, which is actually directed at Sarah. It says, you talked about research into impact on communities and wondered how you intend, who should actually be carrying out the impact relating to your statement around impact on communities that it says that you recommended. So I think it's probably talking about the overall impact on communities and how the research is done or research needs to be done. Not too clear on that, but it's directed at you, Sarah. Any thoughts on that?
No. I think it just needs to be done, and I think it needs to be done ideally by the groups, or at least informed by the groups that are affected, so the right questions are being asked. That's okay. I suppose I would talk about principles rather than who should be doing it.
So links up to co-funding for those, especially BEMA groups, in terms of development of business planning. Is that something you support currently under this?
We at United St Saviour's, not through the Community Response Fund, no. At United St Saviour's, we have been supporting organisations to get capacity building and business development. We're not doing that in the immediate year ahead because of the hit on our income streams. But again, I think it's something that's being recognised London-wide. And I know that the London funders are talking about a programme of capacity building and support that will be made available. And I think in terms of thinking about funders more generally, I think you'll start seeing this coming through. I think you'll start seeing more core funding, and I think you'll start seeing funding for business development, recognising that a lot of organisations are going to be in a bit of a pickle after this. And also, if I'm brutally honest, recognising the fact that there may have to be some mergers and some rationalisation post-COVID. So I think you'll see some support coming in from the larger funders London-wide to help that business development, helping organisations survive or even merge.
Can I just refer to, I mean, we've heard a lot about many funding programs actually closing very early from launch. In fact, there was this case of a funding program that closed 2 days after it was launched. So, so we heard a lot about these issues, and obviously a lot of community organizations are not able to actually receive support or help, which they had actually saved. We also heard about the program that actually received 7,000 applications. I mean, that was quite overwhelming. Do you think that funders have actually underestimated the need within communities for support? And linked to that, you talked about some funders actually getting a hit from the COVID funding program and the wider issues. Should community organizations be worried in terms of how they get funding in the future?
I mean, maybe I could just touch upon something that Sarah said earlier on, which by way of responding to your question, Victor. And one of the things that Sarah mentioned was that Southwark is #1, if you like, on the list of local authority areas that is most successful in getting the London Community Response Fund grants. And that creates its own, it's a success, but it does create its own challenges going forward, because there are other parts of London that are funding cold spots, and funders are aware of those funding cold spots. And some of those areas are not areas without significant need. Some of them have significant need. So what I was really sort of getting towards was that I think where organizations can collaborate and make joint funding applications which take into account some of the broader needs, then that is a way of, if you like, adapting to that position and ensuring that there is a chance to be successful in a very potentially competitive funding environment going forward. As to kind of funding business transformation and so on and so forth, or development of business plans, I mean, that's something that we can think about, of course, as we develop strategic plans. If there may be opportunities to co-fund some of that in the future, but I think we'd have to be really clear where we're trying to get to with that. What the purpose of it is, what the goal that we're trying to achieve through doing that. Because otherwise, we did have, when austerity hit from 2010 onwards, we had a number of Southwark Transition Fund rounds. It's quite a long time ago now, but we funded various forms of business transformation, business planning, fundraising, consultancy. And that was very welcome by the sector, but it didn't necessarily lead to massively different outcomes, or we had organizations that were funded who then went under. So we invested money into an organization to transform, and the organization no longer existed 2 years later. There wasn't a direct correlation, but it doesn't guarantee success. I don't know if that begins to answer your question, Victor. there was quite a lot in that question, wasn't there? There was quite a lot in it. So,
but can I just add? I mean, I do think. I mean, we are sitting here at a Community Southwark conference, and I think there's a really important strategic role for Community Southwark to be playing in this going forward, because it's not just let's look at the needs of particular population groups and how they've been negatively impacted by COVID and the lockdown. It's also what is the impact on the community and voluntary sector in Southwark and going forward. And then what critical role can Community Southwark play in that? At quite a strategic level, I think, and a practical level. And again, it's been everybody coming together and discussing the challenges and thinking about, I don't know, maybe Chris, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and I think I will briefly, probably in my closing comments as well, about the discussion and way forward, because I'm really keen just to utilize, this time with the attendees, for funding, but in short, the answer would be yes on both counts, obviously. But there is probably a longer answer that I would want to give, in a few minutes' time when we will be closing the conference.
Okay, I think what I'll say at this stage is that we do have quite a number of other questions, which will obviously collate and send to you, and hopefully, you'll be able to answer these questions so that we can send them onwards to those who've actually attended. And just to say thank you, for the answers, you've actually provided during this part of the session, and I would actually hand back to Chris, who is going to look at next steps. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Victor. And also briefly, very practical question for Andy coming through the chat. Someone is inquiring about the name of an organization that you mentioned, supporting children with educational needs, which are in contact with schools.
So that's a funder. It's one of the Southwark funders, and I think it's called Newcomen Collett.
Yes, we have that information, so we can provide answer to that question.
I think St Olaf's, sorry to interrupt, I think St Olaf's are also providing laptops.
St Olaf's, thank you.
Another funder, and you can find it on our website as well, on our funding guide.
Yeah, and again, this is something that Victor's got access to as well, and all the resources within Community Southwark, so please make use of those as well. That's what it's there for, and partially answers also Sarah's question about the practical support to a lot of the groups. And just very briefly on final points. Okay, so clearly no one's in the clear, about the future really, at this stage, and why would we be? But what would be the most effective ways, you could say, from your experience as funders, to influence you? So if we've got groups on the call, constituted or not, what is the best way for them to kind of influence your thinking? Because maybe they want to direct you in your funding towards core costs or towards small charities. So what's the best process there?
So I would say partly through the networks that Community Southwark facilitates, the provider-led groups, the work that Community Southwark does with the smaller groups, the smaller groups network, which are the groups that haven't yet fully developed. And I think the other thing that always works, that impresses us as funders, is if groups that have ideas have looked around the local landscape, seen what else is being done, and then they reference that, they talk about it and say, we're part of this, we understand where we fit in a little bit, at least, within this local landscape or borough-wide. So it's almost like two things. One is, these are the needs, we know what the needs are, we see the needs, they're presenting themselves to us all the time, but we understand a little bit about what the landscape is in Southwark. So, because one of the challenges for funders is to be funding lots of things that seem to be good ideas, but are, in many ways, are potentially not necessarily duplicating things, because there can be a lot of demand, but that basically recognize where else some of that need is being met. So if you like, some intelligence of the landscape. I don't know. And so, and tell us, contact us, email us, let us know. There's other channels available, networks and so on. Yeah.
Yep. Do you want me to respond to that one as well?
Yeah, if you can, Sarah. Yeah, briefly, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, we come to Community Southwark quite a lot to understand about what's happening out there. We speak to the organisations we're funding on a regular basis. And we're just up the road. We're just near London Bridge, and just either pick up the phone or drop us an email. Like, we're a local place-based funder, and we like to have conversations with people. So literally just get in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Thank you.
Sorry. So can I just say thank you to our panelists today, Andy and Sarah. Thank you very much for giving the time and for this informative stuff you've actually provided us. I think there's still more answers as well, the more questions really in terms of how we actually deal with the return to normal, and what that will look like. And I'm sure, within Community Southwark itself, we'll be trying to see how we support the sector to understand what shape or form this will look like. And obviously, it's about working in partnership, with our existing partners, the council, United St. Saviour's, and other local partners. So thank you very much for this. And I'll just hand back to Chris to say the final few words.